click on our laptop or TV or handphone and we can join a class. Lord, we thank you for Dr. Anthony and ask that you anoint him so that his teaching will benefit all of us. We thank you for everyone here and ask for attentive hearts and ears to listen to your message. In Jesus' most precious name I pray. Amen.
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 I think Reverend Doctor doesn't need the introduction, right? Over to you, Doctor.
So you can see the slides. So we are now on part 2. Okay. So part 1, we look at, we had so-called an overview of the book, giving you some ideas of what are in the chapters. And we look at especially the first part, which were the 7 letters to the churches. And then we look at second part, which are basically the visions of the future. So today in part 2, I want to look at just 3 things. One is, how do we go about interpreting the book of Revelation? One way is to apply a framework. Okay. So you have a framework that you take from the outside and then you apply into the book, and then that will give us a way to interpret. So you use an external frame, a certain pattern, to try to understand the book. So there are 4 traditional ways, and I'll explain each one of them, and then you can see how each one would cause us to interpret the book in a slightly different way. Then I want to look at the issue of why was the book of Revelation so relevant for the first century, the time of John when he wrote this book to the churches. Why was the message so relevant? And then we make that jump to today. Okay, so we're going to make a jump 2,000 years, and we're going to see, can the book still be relevant for us today after almost 2,000 years? And how do we read the book of Revelation now, especially in the light of all these challenges? We have religious conflict going around the whole world, climate change problems, natural catastrophes. Just recently, India was hit with typhoons, and flooded the whole area. So what do we do with all these? Are these the signs of the times? Do we interpret all this as signs of the times? Therefore, we can say that the chapters of the book are now being fulfilled. So we're going to see how we can read Revelation relevantly. Okay. Not to treat it like a book where we look for things, like some people think, but rather what does the message have to speak to us? So let's look at the 4 ways first. That will help us to look at it. As I say, this is a way where we interpret by putting in an external framework. So traditionally, there have been 4 ways that have been used, 4 different approaches. Each one is given a name. You can see them in the yellow. One view is called the preterist. The word preterist means past. Okay. This one views that the prophecies in the book have largely been fulfilled in the first century, especially at this very important period of time, and that was AD 70, the time when Jerusalem fell to the Romans. And so quite a lot of people take this view that John seems to be talking about AD 70. So the book is written, therefore, about 20 years earlier, and talking about this as a punishment upon the Jewish people. And this view is reflected a lot by people today, by Christians who hold what we call a post-millennial view. I'll explain all these terms as we go along. So the first view is basically to say that already most of the prophecies are fulfilled already. It means today when we read 2,000 years later, we don't need to look at those chapters and point them towards the future, because most of it are supposed to have happened. Then what about this second view called historicist? Historicist is not past tense, but historicists basically look at it as the events are slowing in human history. That's why we use the term historist. And here's the approach that was quite popular for a long time, from the time of the Protestant reformers, Martin Luther, John Calvin. They were using this approach right up to the 19th century. So about 400 years it was very popular. And they were interpreting events happening in human history and pointing back to the chapters in Revelation. And this approach, of course, people still do today. Okay. In fact, one pastor told me that, looking at the fighting between Hamas and Israel, a lot of people are interpreting it as end times, predicted in the book of Revelation, and therefore we are now living in the end time, and Christ is coming soon. So, is that the way we go about reading the book of Revelation? Seeing human history as the arena, and then all these things are slowly happening, and then this approach is called the historicist. The third view is the futurist, and this is the very common view among lay people today. Okay, majority of lay people, especially if you read books like Tim LaHaye's Left Behind series, Salem Caravan 666, John Welwood, Armageddon, the oil and the Middle East. You read all these books, you probably hold a view like this. This view says that no, those chapters, especially in the 4 to 22, are still in the future. They're largely unfulfilled. That means they're not yet happened. We are still waiting for it. And these things will only happen at what we call the end times, a very popular word used by AG people. And these are Christians who hold a view called dispensationalism. I will explain a little bit about this view. So this view makes you very interested, like what some people are doing today. Read the events in world history, like the fight between Hamas and Israel, and try to see where it points out to. So in one of the chapters, you talk about the army from the east coming, and then crossing through the rivers, and then finally getting to Armageddon and having this big fight. So you identify the enemy in the east, China. Okay. So a lot of people do that, and this is, as I said, quite a popular approach. And you can see that these two actually will overlap a lot, because once you start pinpointing events in history, you are becoming more like a historist. Okay, so a futurist is also a historist in the making, because once you start identifying, then you will see you are trying to interpret the chapters in human history. There is a fourth view called idealist. Idealists, the main thing is they basically look at these events in the book as what we call symbolic. That means they are very general. They are not specific events, but they're more general. They represent the ongoing battle between good and evil right through the whole church age. So therefore, you look at those stories in Revelation, they're just a pattern or symbol of what's going on in the world. And in every age and every time, Christians look at it and can see the same pattern repeating again. And this view is very popular among Christians who hold a millennialist position. So you see there's a post-millennialist position, a millennialist, and of course this side is also pre-millennial dispensation. So basically there are four views. Now, let me explain each one and show you how, if you take one approach like that, this is the way you go about reading the book of Revelation. So let's take the first one, the preterist. Remember, preterist is a word for past. So therefore, they're saying what John was writing is actually important, because you need to know his context and the original context. That means the context of the first century is the key. And people who hold this view believe that John was writing to people of his time and telling them this is what's happening now in our time. So therefore, the clue is understand what's happening in the first century. So they take the view that John wrote probably earlier, around the time of Nero, Emperor Nero, and the book is pointing towards a very key event that's going to happen AD 70, the destruction of Jerusalem. So basically, therefore, you understand it as a span. The book is written maybe about 20 years. Okay, you write it in the time of Emperor Nero, and then by the time of the fall of Jerusalem, which is AD 70, it's a span of less than 20 years. So they think that when John wrote this book, these things have not yet happened, but as the Christians look at it, in that span of 20 years, all the things in Revelation slowly unfold, is what they're trying to say. So therefore, John is writing to real churches in the first century about real problems that are happening in their midst. Okay, and there were two big problems in the first century. One was, we know, empire-wide persecution. Many of the emperors persecuted the Christians. The most famous, of course, was Nero. Then after him, of course, there were others like Domitian, Trajan, and others. So right out the Roman period until the time of Constantine, many of the emperors persecuted the Christians because Christianity went against emperor worship. Uh, the Nero, the Caesars of Rome felt that they were also gods, and so they actually forced people to worship them. So then Christianity says, no, we will not bow down to any other lord except Jesus. So that's why they had this empire persecution, and it all leads towards that destruction that Jesus talked a lot about, especially like in Matthew 26 on the Mount of Olives, that discourse, and talking about the day when the abomination of desolation will come and then destroy. And then Jesus says, flee into the hills, and hide on that day. So most people think that Jesus is talking about AD 70. So when you are here, let's say you are the 7 churches that you receive this letter, and you can already see the things happening. The emperor is already having persecution of Christians, and then you have also local problems, and then eventually all lead to that important day, AD 70, when Jerusalem fell. Then you can see like this is already happening in our time. A storm is coming. We need to orientate ourselves for it. Now, today we can see that those who hold a view like post-millennialism, this are a view, a preterist. Post-millennium means they believe that when Jesus talked about the second coming, he will come after a period called the millennium. And post-millennium believe that the millennium is actually what happened already. We are, let's say now in 2021, and we already are now living in 2 millennium. Okay, so 0, and this is BC period, and this is AD period. So we already have Jesus came here and then went back to heaven, and we really are living throughout 2 millennium. So this whole period of time is called the millennial age. So you hold this view, post-millennial says, it is the age that we are living in. This is the millennial age. It already begun when Jesus went back to heaven, and it's still going on, and Christ will return after this millennium. So there will be a second coming, Christ's second coming. When, we do not know, but it is after this period on earth. And so post-millennial tend to be very positive, very optimistic about world history. The world is getting better and better. But unfortunately, with 2 world wars in our century, in the 20th century, the First World War and the Second World War, people began to lose hope in this view because they said, well, the millennium didn't seem to be better. It's actually getting worse, because today you read the news, there's really very little good news. The world doesn't seem to be getting better and better. The world seems to be actually becoming worse. So this view today is falling out of favor, because people realize the world is not turning better. So if you are a preterist, you see the book of Revelation as considering the period from Nero, which is around this period of time, all the way right down to AD 70. So that short period of time. So therefore, you can say most of chapters 4 to 22 of the book of Revelation are already fulfilled in this period of time. In this so-called like 20 years, all these things have already happened. So they believe that Nero is the so-called the beast, the emperor that's being referred to here. And so you can find references that they believe refers to Nero. We know that Nero was a very crazy fellow. He did persecute a lot of Christians. Many Christians died at his hands. He will throw Christians into the arena where they will be killed by the gladiators. Some of the Christians had to fight against lions in the arena. And then sometimes he dipped Christians in tar, bitumen, and then set them alight at night to become human torches. So we know he did blame the Christians, because remember Rome burned, and then he put the blame on the Christians. So he was one who did persecute the Christians. And then there were also local persecution on the Christians that came from Jews. And so twice in the 7 churches, in 2 churches, you read about opposition from the Jews. John calls them, they are not Jews, but from the synagogue of Satan. So they were Jews who also had problems. And we know the Jews didn't like the Christians, because they say Christianity is a Jewish sect. Jesus is a rabbi who went astray and then now teaching this wrong teaching. So Christians then look at AD 70, the fall of Jerusalem, as God's punishment upon the Jews. See, you guys rejected Jesus, therefore God destroys Jerusalem. So for them, therefore, this whole thing is fulfilled. And they say the book refers to before AD 70 because there's one chapter in the book of Revelation that mentions the temple, chapter 11. Okay, Revelation 11 talks about the temple. So John says, I was given a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there, but do not measure the court outside the temple. So there's a mention of a temple now. Some people think that this is not a physical temple. Some people think that John is measuring the heavenly temple. But this view sees it as a physical temple. That means the temple still stood in Jerusalem at this time. And therefore, all these views point to the fact that we are talking about a period from here to here. And therefore, when you read Revelation today, we are living in the aftermath. Everything is already over. Okay. So a preterist view of Revelation will be like this. Chapter 1, John sees a vision of the risen Christ and he's told, write down this letter and send it to the 7 churches. And then chapters 2 and 3, the 7 churches receive commendation or criticism. Okay. And they are told to stand. Okay. Because there will be local persecution from the Jews. There will be empire-wide persecution from the Romans. So they are to be aware that persecution will come in 2 ways. Okay. And then when you read chapter 4 and 5, John is taken to heaven to see what's happening, how Christ will reign in heaven. Then 6 to 18, he's back on earth. And these are cycles of judgment that repeats in a cycle of three cycles of 777. And basically, he's talking about Jerusalem will be destroyed. So you take a view where everything has already happened, therefore all these chapters are already past. Okay, all these chapters are in the past, already happened, because today we are more than 2,000 years after all this. Then 19 is about how Christ comes and he will complete his judgment. So therefore, again, Jerusalem destroyed, but Christ comes and then have that final judgment, the Bema throne, and all this. And then the last 3 chapters about Christ's millennial rule. So the millennial rule starts from the time of Jesus, from AD 70, the destruction, and now all the way 2021, we are now still living in the time of the millennial age. So this is how preterist people interpret Revelation. As I said today, this view is no longer in favor because 2 world wars have forced people to argue that, are you sure that this period of time is the millennium? Okay. Or is the millennium yet to happen? You see, that's what the other views will say. This view says the millennium already is on earth. It means there is not a new heaven, a new earth. The new is basically the world being recreated and getting better and better and better. So it's a different concept. That means the world, the present age will get better. Whereas other view says, no, the world will be destroyed, then God will bring a new Jerusalem and a new earth. Okay, so this view today, as I say, there is less people holding this view. Okay, one can see, because if you treat everything as already happened in the past, then there's nothing left to happen. All we're seeing is now just the millennial rule. But the problem is, Christ doesn't seem to be worshipped by people. People still do not bow the knee, as what Philippians says, every tongue will confess that Christ is Lord. No, not every tongue will confess Christ is Lord. So this millennial rule doesn't seem to be the millennial rule that Jesus is talking about. So this view, very few people, maybe 10% people still hold this view. The historicist was a very popular view. It took over from the idealists, and then at one time was very popular until the time of the 15th century. Martin Luther and all these people, they were very popular with Martin Luther, John Calvin. They used this view of historics. In fact, Martin Luther was very interested in Revelation. He read it and he felt that Revelation was happening in his time. So that when you read about that woman in red, and then there's this dragon with the 7 heads and with a tail that swipes down 1/3 of stars, he said that woman is Babylon. And that is the papal city in Vatican. So he was reading it in his context. Okay. So This view basically look at the prophecies of Revelation as slowly unfolding in world history. That means if you are a student holding this view, called the historicist view, you look at the events that's happening and you seek to identify them. Okay, so for example, like, oh, this is happening, this fight among these people with these people, or that one is happening in chapter uh, 7 of Revelation. So you try to seek and connect the book with world history. And so one can see the reformers like Martin Luther, they saw the Roman Catholic papacy of the day and identified the Pope with the Antichrist. The Pope, according to Martin Luther, was the Antichrist. Babylon, the cryptic name of that city against God, was the Vatican City, because that's where the Pope lived. Okay. In fact, Martin Luther read quite a lot of things. When he read about the armies that look like locusts, he argued that that army that looked like locusts was the Arabian army that was coming out of the desert, the Islamic army coming out and then conquering everything in their path. And why he just say that they are this? Because they have long hair flying in the wind. Well, these guys wear a turban and the turban flies in the wind. Then they make a lot of noise. Well, the Arabian people, they make a noise, you know, to frighten the enemy. So they like that. So he really reads it as the Arabian army as he read that thing. So he was very convinced that he was living in the end times, and he was very, very excited with the book of Revelation. I have a picture of by Lucas Cranach. Lucas Cranach was a printer and a famous artist as well, who painted a picture, a portrait of Martin Luther. He had one painting of Babylon, and the woman is sitting on the dragon with the 7 head, all this, and that is linked to the Papal City. So he had one picture of that where the Vatican City is that woman and that dragon, that red dragon with that 7 heads. So he was quite convinced that they were seeing all these things happening in their time. See? Now, today in our time, we see people who hold this view still doing the same thing. Everybody tries to find out who is the Antichrist. So think of all the candidates that people have found. In World War II, people say Hitler was the Antichrist. In the 50s, with the Russian persecution of Christians, Joseph Stalin was the Antichrist. Then Mao Zedong was the Antichrist. Saddam Hussein was the Antichrist. Khomeini of Iran was Antichrist at one time. Osama also, and now probably is Putin. So everybody has been trying. Now the problem with this is each time you identify and you fail, then you have to keep revising back. Oh, maybe you got it wrong. Maybe it is not this one, but this one. Then you keep on revising and changing. Then eventually you do have problems. Then people say, how do I believe you? Because each time you keep changing and say, no, it's not this. Well, and what if it's not Putin but someone else? Then you keep changing. See, so this view today no longer hold ground, simply because of the repeated failure to pinpoint the events of revelation in human history. Each time they say this one, then things today no longer like that. And if you keep getting it wrong and you keep subjecting your view to revision, you can lose popularity. Now, imagine those days in the 70s, everybody was excited. Why? Because you have the Cold War from the 50s coming in. So it is USA versus USSR. Those days, remember, it was a United Soviet Republic. It was a huge, very big entity. And people identified that as the Antichrist. So there was a book printed in 1975. I remember going to Silfest in Section 5, Pataling Gardens in PJ. And they were advertising that book on the bookshelf. It was written by a Singapore professor, a Christian, Chinese guy. I can't remember his name. He wrote a book, The Antichrist Review, ... and then Russia. So confident was he that, you know, he identified like that and said, this is the Antichrist. Well, today, there's no more USSR. USSR, remember, broke apart after Gorbachev. There's only left Russia and all the different smaller uh, states that came out, Kazakhstan, and all those nations. There's no more USSR. Then at one time, everybody was so interested in European Union when it was formed. They said that is the beast with the 10 horns. Why? When EU started, they had 10 nations. See, but then today EU is now 27 nations. What has happened? There's no longer 10 horns. It's now 27. So again, you identify the EU and you say that is the beast that came up from the sea with the 10 horns. When it first started, it was with 10 nations. So people were very excited. This is the beast. But today, EU is 27 nations. See, you have to revise again. Now, each time you revise, you lose popularity because you have been proven wrong. Like in the Old Testament times, each time a prophet preached wrong, you are supposed to be stoned. And then there's also a lack of consensus because different interpreters identify different historical details. So, like for example, John Wellwood, he wrote this book. I remember reading this book in the 70s. Okay, Armageddon, oil, and the Middle East crisis. And he was so sure because of the oil, discovery of oil in the Middle East, and then now all the Arab nations have money and all this, and they're going to overturn the whole thing, and therefore Armageddon is going to happen soon within a few years. I remember reading this book, and everybody was talking about it. Well, nothing has happened so far. How many years has passed since his book, 1976? Or the other book by Salam Kirban, 666. And then he wrote a sequel to it, 1000 Millennium. And all this, we were also interested. There was even a comic version to 666, a comic version where the Antichrist enters and then into the mosque, and then with his laser ruby ring, burn down the mosque and then build a new temple. I remember reading that comic strip, and Salam Kirban one was like so influential in so many young people's understanding of what was happening. And so I look forward every month receiving Reverend Ronnie Korn's ABL newsletter. Remember, he used to send out a newsletter printed in newsprint, and then I always send to the section about all these prophecies are happening, and then they are supposedly identify all the prophecies. But you see now how the historicist interpretation has fallen out of favor, because if you keep on interpreting like that and you find that it cannot work, then you are losing what? You're losing people's trust, you see. Each time you subject, make a revision, it's not now, but 10 years from now. You keep on changing, then people will say, no, I think your view is something wrong. Something is wrong with your view. Okay. So historicists today has also fallen out of favor because it's been proven wrong so many times. Now this is the one that is popular with lay people. I would say in Malaysia, among all the AGs, the independent churches, this is the view of all these people, the AG people. People who buy books by Tim LaHaye, Left Behind series, you hold this view. Okay. So what is this view? Futurist. Futurist interpretation says the prophecies about Revelation are still largely unfulfilled. That means not yet in history. There's not been a time in history where these things have happened. Therefore, when you read this middle block of 4 to 22, all these things will only happen in the end time. This is a very popular popular phrase. Each time something happens, end times, end time prophecies. You preach a sermon on end times prophecy, I think you get a lot of likes on the YouTube, that's for sure. But the problem is, when is the end time? Okay, I know a lot of the AG people say, oh, now. But then I say, what you see supposedly happen in end times has already started from Jesus' time till now. The end times is from then till now. How long is the end times? End time is supposed to be the end, towards the end, see? But already now we have gone down to 2021 since the time of Jesus, let's say 30 AD. So when is the end times? Because every age there seem to be all these things happening. Wars, rumors of wars, fighting, killing, natural disasters. So when is the end time? Every age people say it is the end time. Like Martin Luther felt 15th century was the end time. Today, when is the end time? Now, people here today in 2021 are so sure we are living in the end times. What if Christ doesn't come and we live another 40 years down the road? Then our children look at and say, oh, you guys are all wrong. Okay, What if Christ doesn't come? What if there are people now living 40 years, 20 years after our time, and they will look at it and say, well, you guys got it all wrong because you understand the end time. So when is the end time? That's the difficulty. Now, this view was popular because it's part of a system of teaching called dispensationalism. It was taught by an Anglican guy, part of a group called the Plymouth Brethren, and it's only in the 19th century. So it actually is not a teaching which is a long time, only recent, less than 200 years. He taught it, and somehow the teaching went into the Scofield Bible, and the Scofield Bible was very popular among AG people, especially, uh, and it found its way into Dallas. And Dallas Theological Seminary is a hotbed for dispensationalism. That was like a headquarters, because the principles of Dallas Theological Seminary were all in favor of this teaching. And then this teaching went from England, went to the East. You'd be surprised. How come it end up in China, this teaching? It was brought back by Watchman Nee. Watchman Nee went and visited England at the time and met these people, and especially J.N. Darby. And it's believed that Watchman Nee brought back this teaching to China in his time, in the late 30s. That's why you find a lot of Chinese people at that time also hold this view. Now, what is dispensationalism? It's a view which divides salvation history, not human history, but salvation history, into different ages or dispensation. So they use this word, which actually came from one of the texts in, I think, Second Corinthians, about this age or this dispensation, aeon. In Greek, it is aeon. That's where we get our English word aeon. So they believe that God works in different times. So they divide it into 8 dispensations. Age of innocence, Adam and Eve, period. Age of conscience, after they've sinned, then they now have a conscience. Civil government, all the way until Tower of Babel. Then age of promise, Abraham's time. And then Mosaic law, Moses' time. Church and the age of grace is our time, New Testament period. That means there's still 2 more that's not yet. These 2 belongs to the end time. So they believe that you can divide history, salvation history, into 8 dispensations. So all this already happened. The first 6 already happened. We are now living here in the church of the age of grace. Then will come the end times, and then there will be tribulation, and then only after all these things happen, then there's the millennium. Dispensation believe that you can divide all of God's salvation history into 8 periods of time. And therefore, Revelation is, the prophecies of Revelation are targeted more, they believe, to the end times, and therefore to the age of tribulation and the age of millennium. Little is for here. Only a little bit is about here, and that is chapters 2 to 3, especially the letters to the 7 churches. Okay, the rest of it, 4 to 22, are mostly for end times. See, that's how, if you hold a view like this is the way you divide your book. Chapters 2 and 3, the 7 letters, they are our, in the 6th dispensation, the church age. Then 7 and 8 dispensation are basically where you find all these chapters. Okay, so a futurist view of Revelation we see from a dispensationalist viewpoint. At this moment, we are living in the 6th dispensation, the age of the church and the age of grace. But coming soon is the 7th age and the 8th dispensation. Okay, so there are 2 more coming, and it is this time when the prophecies largely belong. Okay, so therefore they think that all the prophecies from here are all mostly applicable into here. Now, the only question then is, has the age of the church and age of grace ended, and have we moved into tribulation? That means from the 6th, have we crossed over to the 7th? That is the difficult part. Are we still in the 6th, or have we gone into now? Because if we have gone into now, then definitely this is end times. Now here is where the people who hold this view, they themselves also disagree. See, some people say, yeah, we're living in end times. I heard that said way back in the 70s. Okay. When I became a Christian in the 70s, middle of 70s, and then by 80s, by the 80s, the charismatic movement came to Malaysia. And many of the traditional churches lost a lot of their members because of the charismatic movement. And these members then left and went to join the AG churches. And once they join the AG churches, they believe in this view, and therefore they already said end times is already upon us. So way back in the 80s, the mid-80s, I was already hearing people say, we are already living in end times. Now, if you're talking about the mid-80s, and you already said we are living in the end times, we are now 2021. How many years have already passed? 40 over years. And have we seen these things happening? Well, still a big question mark, you see, because as Jesus says, there will be wars and rumors of wars and fighting and all this, but these are only what he says, birth pangs. They're not the real thing yet. So perhaps you're only seeing the beginning part, but not the real. So question is, when is the end time starting? That's where they all disagree. Now, as I say, futurist view can also become a historist view. The moment you start pinpointing events, oh, now this is what this chapter 5 is about, this one in world history, chapter 6 about this. Once the moment you begin pinpointing it into human history and it doesn't work, then your view becomes historist view. Okay, so there's a danger you can eventually move from one to the other. Now, this dispensation is part of this whole teaching of premillennialism, which I don't believe. Okay, because they say that in human history, Christ will come again. But the problem is Christ's second coming is split into two. Very interesting. This is due to J.N. Darby's teaching. For me, there was a first coming of Jesus, and that was his first coming as a savior. And that happened way back in 4 BC to perhaps 29 AD. Okay. So there will be a second coming. The question is, when is the second coming? Dispensationalist people split the second coming into two. Very interesting. They split it into two. So that Christ comes, then immediately he raptures the church and takes them back to heaven. Then only much later will he come again in the real second coming. So they add in something called a rapture. The church will be taken up to heaven. So they read the text in Thessalonians about Christ coming in the clouds. They read that as the rapture event. Christ comes halfway, we go up halfway, we meet halfway, he takes us back to heaven, and then comes the tribulation. And then only when Christ comes again and then camp everything, only then millennium can happen. Now this is the so-called pre-millennial tribulation, or pre-trib as we used to call it, pre-tribulation. So the church will be raptured and will be in heaven, and then there will be this great tribulation. Now, I have really problem with this view simply because, one, if the church is raptured, then who are the people suffering in the time of tribulation? Then who's God going to use to be witnesses in the time of tribulation? Now here's where they say God will use back the Jews. And which I say, no, I don't think so. The Jews don't want to believe in God, so why should God use back the Jews? If God has taken away every good Christian up to heaven in the rapture, then who is left to be doing the witnessing? See? So they say God will use the Jews. And here I said, no, I don't hold a view like this. So I have problems with pre-trib. Okay. And so this view, futurist view, has two types which are actually almost the same. It's just that they have different names, and this one is a modification of this one. So just look at classical dispensation and you can see why they thought like this. Okay. So if you hold a view like classical dispensation, then what are your characteristics? One, they will treat the prophecies in the book of Revelation very literally. No, they are not symbolic. They must happen exactly like this. If the sun turns dark, it will turn dark. If the moon becomes blood red, it means blood red. They take it literally. Then these chapters are all still in the future, not yet happened. They're in the end times. And some of them say already end times has come, so we are already overlapping and we are already seeing the things happening. And they take this view because of one key verse. One key verse in chapter 1, verse 19, where Jesus tells, the risen Christ tells John, now write what you see, what is, and what is to take place. They treat it as, okay, what Jesus says has three parts to it. what we have seen is the past. That means all that happened in chapter 1. Then what is now, that is the present, and there's a time of the 7 churches, and this is basically 1st century AD. Then they say what will take place. This one is a future, and this will locate the bulk of the whole book into the future. That means you don't find anything in 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 happening in the 7 churches. They are all in end times. So therefore, the book, one single chapter about the past, chapter 1, chapters 2 and 3 are about 1st century AD, rest of the book, end times. So the book of Revelation is divided in first, you can say, the 1st century AD, chapter 1, chapter 2, and 3. But then chapter 4 to 22, the majority part of the book, end times. So the book is actually very lopsided. Jesus say very little to the people at the time. Everything is actually kept for the future, for us, for people living like us in end times. See, they're very confident. The book has very little to say to actually John's time. The book has more to say to our time. Now, I have a problem with this. See, the problem is you treat these chapters as our time. But isn't that what Martin Luther did? Each time he read and said, oh, this is referring to the papacy, Babylon, is the beast, the Antichrist. He also read it as his time, and he has been proven wrong. So how sure are we that all these chapters are only end time? Well, they use one argument. The argument is very simple. You don't find the mention of a church in chapter 4 all the way. You're talking about the word church in terms of the Greek word ecclesia. Of course, then the word is not used, but they use the word people of God or the people of every tribe, tongue, nation. But they say, oh, this word ecclesia is not mentioned. Therefore, the church has already been raptured to heaven. See, by that time, pop, the church goes up to heaven, and then all these things happen to not the church, but to the people left behind. That's why the series, Tim LaHaye series, the Left Behind series, was a bestseller in the US. And I remember they say that when they did the 7th and final, they did it in the movie. And then the final one, I think the 7th or the 8th one was the highest attended. A lot of people went and viewed it at the time because everybody was so sure that this is what's happening in America, and the church is left behind. So the rapture theory tells you that suddenly, a car will be driving, then the driver will just disappear and left behind his clothes and his shoes. And the car will crash. So when we read all this those days, wow, aeroplane will fall down from the sky, trains will crash because there's no driver, and then only happens the Great Tribulation. Now this is a view which holds a very pessimistic view. The world is getting from bad to worse, and until Christ comes again. So Christ must come, and then you find all the judgment taking place. Millennium will not come. Millennium will only come much later in time, only after judgment and all this. So 21 talks about the lake of fire, and then the beast and the Christ all be thrown into the lake of fire. Only then everything settled, then only comes the millennium. Now this view, as I say, is very popular with lay people who read the Bible very literally, read Revelation very literally, influenced by dispensationalist teaching. Things that the chapters here are all talking about end times, and we are now living in end times. If you hold this view, then you are holding this third view, futurist interpretation. Okay, so progressive is just a little bit different. It's just modified, that's all. Really not yet. So they believe that when Christ comes, that was the already. But the kingdom is not yet in its full form, not yet. So when Christ came, he brought a little bit of the guarantee of the kingdom, but one day we will wait for the final part. So again, the way you read the book, the first few chapters, 1 to 3, are all in the 1st century, and then the rest of the book, the not yet, are prophecies now. So we wait for rapture, church taken up to heaven, then comes the Great Tribulation, and then 7 years, and after that, the Antichrist will be defeated, and Christ will come again. And so all this, then judgment, and then only millennium. So you follow the same sequence. Now, if you hold a view like that, then you're holding a futurist view. And I suspect many churches today hold a view like this, especially AG churches. And some people, even in the more traditional churches, if you have been reading books from the US, books coming in printed by these people like John Welwood, Tim LaHaye, and all this, you will probably hold a view like this. I grew up on this diet because I was reading books like this, but thankfully I learned to win away from it. So today I don't hold a view like this. Okay. Okay, one more final view, then you can take the four together. The fourth view is called idealist. Sometimes it's called the spiritualist view because you tend to interpret the book in a more spiritual or symbolic sense. That means you're saying you cannot connect the chapters, the prophecies of Revelation to actual historical events because what is in the book of Revelation is symbolic. They are just patterns and symbols to represent an ongoing conflict between good and evil. Good and evil has been happening ever since the time Jesus went back to heaven. Okay. And till now, 2021, this ongoing battle is still going on. Good and evil are still uh, trying to overcome each other. So the book is just basically telling you this ongoing struggle will go all the way until the end, until before finally Christ comes again, and then there'll be victory. Okay, so they are not in a sense predictive. They are not predicting actual events, but they're more just in general sense. Something like this will happen in the future. Okay, so when you read things like bowls of wrath and all this, well, it just say that, well, things will just go from bad to worse. The church will undergo lots of trouble, and trouble will continue to increase. So you have to speak in very general terms. Now, this idea came about from a what we call the Alexandrian school in the early church father period, around the 3rd century AD. There were different schools of thought. You have the literary school, you have the spiritualist school like this. And this school that belongs to the Alexandria school, where people like Clement and Origen belong, they tend to use allegory or symbolic interpretation to interpret scripture. Okay, so therefore, apply that into the book of Revelation. They say, well, Revelation may talk about a dragon. It's not really a dragon. It's just a symbol of evil and power. So you don't read it as a real dragon. Okay, everything is symbolic. And you find that Christians today, when you hold this view, most of them who hold this view are people who are called amillennialists. Amillennialists from the word which is the Greek for a negative. Okay, so it means they don't believe in a real millennial. The millennial is just symbolic. That means there's not an actual. See, the third view believes the dispensationalists believe that when you talk about a millennial period, it's actually 1,000 years. Dispensationalists, so they will treat the millennial, the 1,000 years, as literal. Exactly 1,000 years will happen, not more, not less. I will tend to read the 1,000 years as more symbolic. So this one will treat the 1,000 years as just a symbolic, it's just a round number for a long period of time. Because the millennial caused a lot of problems too. Remember, we have now already entered into the second millennial period. In the first millennial period was the year 1000 AD. Okay, we are now living in 2021 AD, and we already crossed the second millennial, into the second millennial. I remember when we were in that, this year, it was the what we call Y2K problem. Everybody thought that, the year 2000, computers will not work because our dates could not go beyond 1999. And so planes will crash and all sorts of things. So there was a huge panic around this time. Do you know that actually at this time, they were also having problems in Europe? Okay. In Europe, people are also having problems, and there was also widespread panic. People thought that the world will come to an end because after all, it's 1 millennium, and they thought Christ will return. So they thought the second coming was imminent. So people were all in panic. People sold their homes, got ready waiting for Christ, but nothing happened. Then we find that today some people do that in the same way as well. So the idealist says, no, treat it as symbolic. This number doesn't really mean exactly 1,000 years, each year 365 days, but rather it's a symbolic number. Okay. So what happened to my text? So there's no hard and fast rule to delineate the structure of the book. The book should be read largely as symbolic. So when you read all these visions, they're just showing you struggles. So when John sees things happening in heaven, is a reminder to us, if you are faithful, you'll be in heaven. See, then he shows you when things are happening on earth, that shows you if you are faithless, these things will happen to you. You. So heaven and earth are just representing two ways of our response to God. So the key to the whole book is the struggles, the ongoing struggles. So they don't look at the key text as a chapter 22. Some Christians look at 22, the millennium, as the climax of the whole book. Everything is moving towards a millennium. Here is basically about what's happening on earth, the struggle that we Christians have against forces of evil. So we don't read Revelation as 2020 as a literal or chronological reading. This way of reading means you treat it as one thing happening at a time, one after another, one after another. So there will be war against the devil and the beast and the antichrist and all this, and then they will lose, and then the devil and the Satan will be thrown down for 1,000 years and locked in the pit, and then there will be that 1,000 years millennial reign, and after 1,000 years, the devil will be let loose again, and then Satan will come out again, and then the whole world will be deceived. They will follow them, and again, one more time, Christ comes and then delivers uh, the world and all of us from the evil one, and then this time they're thrown into a lake of fire. So you, there is the millennials and dispensationalists tend to read chapter 20 as a chronological sequence of things that happen. Whereas this view said no, they're just merely symbolic. We don't read it as one after another. Okay. Now this view has some value because it's trying to tell us that in every age, doesn't matter, it's giving us timeless truths that there is a battle going on, a conflict through the ages, as one of the hymns uses to remind us. There's a conflict through the ages, and it's going on, and evil is trying to overcome good, but one day we know good will overcome evil. So there's a battle that's going on. The book of Revelation is just giving us patterns to remind us of this constant struggle. So therefore, there are truths for us. Now, this can be a refreshing alternative for those people who are burned out by predictive prophecies which fail. Because if you are in the historic line of interpretation and you keep on trying to show what's happening in the world as referring to one chapter in Revelation, and then you're proven wrong, you can get burned out. You get, in the end, disappointed, discouraged because things are not happening. Or if you are in the futurist in the way of interpretation, and you're saying we're living in the end times, but then, as you say, if you started doing this in the 80s, 40 years have passed now, and things are still not yet working out. So how long is the end times? And people are still saying we are living in the end times. Well, I would say everybody has been talking about end times of 2,000 years already. In fact, Paul, when he wrote the letters to Thessalonians, he thought he was living in the end times. That's why he wrote in Thessalonians about Christ will come, and then describes the second coming and all this. So he thought he was living in end times, but it didn't happen. So if you get very frustrated by all these failed prophecies, so many people have pointed out Antichrist, and so many people have been wrong, then perhaps this view gives you an alternative. Well, we don't need to look exactly for a correlation between human history and the book. The book is just giving us timeless truths. In every age, there will be conflict. In every age, there'll be fighting. In every age, there'll be evil people. So the way you go about reading the book of Revelation depends actually on your will, how you look at the book. Okay, so each view has its own strength. Preterist view, past holds a positive view. They're saying that the world is getting better and better because ultimately the gospel will triumph. Now, of course, we know the world is not getting better so far. So today, a lot of people get discouraged. The world is not getting better and better. In fact, evil seems to be triumphing everywhere. Okay. Idealist view remind us, be realistic. See, don't waste up time trying to pinpoint and try to say this chapter refers to this event. The church can only be successful, we can stay true to God only because of the guidance of the Holy Spirit. So we just hold on, don't lose sight of our fight. Remember, it's an ongoing battle. We wait until Christ comes again to deliver us. So this one is, we are not busy trying to identify and pinpoint events. The futurist view is the one that says, no, all history is turning back from bad to worse, and we are living in end times, and the prophecies are really happening now already. So I'm not sure which view you want to hold. I suspect, as I said, all the AG, most of the AG people are all holding this view. But it's, as I said, dispensationalism and all this is a view that was taught only by Jan Darby around 18 something. So it's not a view that is actually, I would say, uh, been around for a long time. The reformers never taught a view like dispensationalism. Thomas Aquinas, Aquinas never taught a view like dispensationalism. The early church fathers, Origen, Clement, Tertullian, Augustine, never taught a view like dispensationalism. So I don't hold a view like this. So my view is perhaps a combination of something like this, that yes, in history, we can perhaps see some of these things happening because they are patterns. Remember, they are timeless truths to remind us that in every age there will be this fight. So therefore, I'm not worried trying to identify who is this woman dressed in red, what is this dragon with the 7 heads. They're just timeless truths for every age. In every age, these things will happen, and they will repeat again and again. The church will go through struggles. We will be thrown to the lions. We will be arrested. We will be put to death. Some will survive. Some will live. It's happening again and again and again. So in a way, I'll hold a view like this. And of course, this view, I will still believe that the gospel still ultimately will triumph. One day, Christ will return and will triumph. Even though there have been 2 world wars and there's so much fighting today, but Christ never says the world will get better before he comes. In fact, as you read Matthew 26, the world will get increasingly worse as it comes. So you can see it's actually a combination of wheels, rather than one single wheel to read the book of Revelation. Rather, it is actually a combination of wheels that is true. So don't just use one and apply that lens and try to read the whole book and force a reading into the book. I would rather say, let the book not be forced into any framework, but let the book tell us at this point, is it a lesson for us to learn? At this point, is it something that will happen in history? I will take it that way. Okay. So tomorrow's sermon, I will preach on chapters 4 and 5, which I believe is the key chapters to the whole book of Revelation, 4 and 5. Okay. And so tomorrow's sermon is entitled The Throne and the Lamb. 4 and 5, I take it as a key chapters, the key to unlocking how to read the book of Revelation. And I think that understanding that key will prevent us from being over obsessed with trying to find answers to the book through the imagery, through the numbers. A lot of people spend time not trying to identify what is 666, what is the 7, what is the 12, what is the 144,000, what is the 1,000. They spend so much time obsessed with trying to interpret all this imagery. I think if you understand 4 and 5, it prevents you from a very obsessive view. It also helps you not to swing to the opposite direction of saying that the book has nothing relevant for us today, because the book has a message that's already all in the past. I think it prevents you from holding that view either. So it gives a more balanced view. So look forward to that sermon for tomorrow. Okay. Okay, I look at the time, it's already 1 hour. Billy, what do you think? Should we stop now and take Q&A? It's already 9.
Are there questions?
Or do you want me to go on a little bit?
I think it's up to you.
Okay, let me see. I'll take, let's say, 15 minutes to kind of cover up everything.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so the next question that I ask is, why was Revelation so relevant in the 1st century AD? That's because when John wrote in chapter 1, John was writing, he says, I am, a brother together with you in tribulation. Okay. So he is writing this. Okay. So chapter 1, verse 9, I, John, your brother, who share with you in Jesus the tribulation and the kingdom and the patient endurance was on the island. So there were trials and troubles among the churches as we read in Revelation 2 to 3. Revelation 2 and 3 are very interesting. There are 7 representative churches. Each one is shown as they are so-called responding to what's happening. External forces, internal forces. And external forces are those connected with the Roman Empire, empire-wide persecution, Jews who were jealous of the Christians and perhaps now opposing them. So perhaps reporting them to the Romans, and then that's why they end up with a lot of these trials. But there are also internal forces. Internal forces would be like, for example, some Christians felt that maybe we should accommodate, give in a little bit. Maybe we can pretend to worship the Roman emperor, and then we won't get executed. And so Christians began to differ how to respond. And very interesting, you wait till Dr. Lim Kai Yong comes and tell you about the 7 churches. Some churches felt that perhaps we can tolerate some of these things that are happening. So there was one church that tolerated the teaching of a lady called Jezebel. Some churches tolerated the teaching of a group called the Nicolaitans. No, Christ says you should not. See, so even within the church, Christians also differ. Now look at it today. We can see, well, in the 21st century, we still have the same problem. There are external forces on the church. We are still facing problems today. We face problems from secularism, materialism. We face competition from other religions. Then internal forces, we are also divided. As a church, you can find that your good friend holds a futurist way to read the text of Revelation, whereas you hold maybe a historist view of reading the book of Revelation, and two of you cannot agree. See, we also find external, internal forces plaguing us. And the Roman Empire, for all the good it did, I mean, it did a lot of good. It gave peace. Remember, Pax Romana was something that was really cherished by the people. Pax Romana means there was peace brought by Rome for almost 400 years. Before, from the BC period under Julius Caesar, all the way before the sacking of Rome by Attila the Hun, there was this Pax Romana, Roman peace. So it did a lot of good. It united the kingdom with a common language, Greek. It gave them peace. There were good roads that connected all the different cities. But there was also a dark side. The Roman Empire was not favorable to the Christians. To the Christians, the Roman Empire was the beast. That's why you read 17. When you read Revelation 17, you can see how when you talk about that beast, okay, that great harlot that was Rome, and the beast with the 7 heads and the 10 horns, and then that beast has that mark on it, and all this. And so they identified Rome with the beast in the 17. So when John is given this revelation to address the churches, it reminds the church, yeah, I know you are struggling. And each church is weighed. Some churches receive commendations. You're strong, you have this against this, therefore Christ commends them. And there were churches that had criticisms. You tolerated this teaching, you should not. Or you gave in, or you're no longer hot or cold, you're lukewarm. Each church was either criticized or commended. There were only 2 churches that were highly commended, no criticisms. All the other churches has a share of criticism and commendation. So when the churches that received this letter, remember Ephesus, Smyrna, Laodicea, Pergamon, when they all were reading it, they understood, yeah, this message is so relevant, okay? But in the years after that, it was a difficult message because it was a very controversial message. Not everybody could agree how to interpret. And the book of Revelation was a book which we know took a long time before it was finally accepted into the canon of Scripture. Only by the Council of Trent, 4th century AD, numerous debates and all this, finally they accepted the book of Revelation into the New Testament canon. Because It was a very controversial book because different people, even like today, we can see we can have 4 different ways to read the book. So like other contemporary apocalyptic literature that uses symbols, numbers, and imagery and all this, it hides behind those things, but it speaks of a single message, hope, that good triumphs over, although you may not see happening in our time. In our time, evil seems to be triumph, or seems to be winning, but ultimately God will triumph over evil. So you look at it, you can see, did Rome last? No. After 40 years, Rome also fell. Rome also could not unseat God. Rome, that so-called that beast, that city, that woman in red, could not unseat God from his throne. Other opponents that the Christians faced, Jews who reported on the Christians, Nicolaitans whose teaching perhaps dilute the Christian faith. Then there were people who followed the teachings of Balaam, people who followed the teachings of a lady called Jezebel. All these also could not deter the Christians. In the end, where are all these people? They're gone. Christians have survived. And the devil also could not push God out of heaven. The devil cannot win. One day, the devil will be thrown into the lake of fire. So therefore, if you were a Christian living in the first century, under stress, persecution, trials, and all this, Revelation make a lot of sense. And I think that's why today, so many people, so many Christians today find the book of Revelation so interesting, because if you are under siege, if you are having problems, similar problems, perhaps you're living in Afghanistan as a Christian, and you find Taliban is a threat. You know, they come and they force you to either recant your faith under the threat of death or life, and you find yourselves under siege, and you turn to Revelation, and you make a lot of sense. If you are living, let's say, also in a time of like in the Middle East, religious conflict, fighting between Jews and now the PLO and Hamas, you read the book, and you find yourselves relevance in the book. Because if you're a Christian and you find two big brothers fighting and you are caught in the middle, it's like the two elephants fighting and the mouse is caught in the middle, you turn to Revelation, and again, it makes a lot of sense. So Christians in every age look at the book of Revelation and find a lot of sense, because it speaks to people who are facing trials and tribulation. And it makes a lot of promises. First promise is Jesus says, I'm coming soon. Now, how do you understand the word soon? The word in Greek is take, and take means quickly or shortly. That means soon, like in the horizon. And in terms of time, it says the time is near. Now, the word time that's used in Revelation here is kairos, not the usual for chronos. Chronos is where we get the word chronology. Chronology means time as it goes from, let's say, 30th AD and moving now to 2021. That time, that type of time is called chronos. That's where we have chronology. Kairos is a different set of time. Kairos is a time that goes towards a purpose. Okay. Kairos can be cyclical, but it moves towards an end. There's an end, a purpose. That's Kairos. And this is the word that is used for the time. The Kairos is near. And this word near is egos in Greek, which means imminent. That means Christ's coming is imminent, like on the horizon. Okay. It doesn't give you a time frame. There is no time frame when Christ will return. All Christ says, very imminent. I am coming soon. But it doesn't give you a time frame to pinpoint and to say July 19, 2024. No, you can't do that. There's no time frame provided. It is very general. It is just soon. And then when Revelation, all the things takes place, the promise is one day all trials and tribulations will end. Now you may have trials and tribulations and troubles, and you'll be crying and weeping. Okay, and our prayers will ascend to God like the smoke of the incense, and we will struggle, but God one day will wipe everything gone. And then God will make all things new. Whatever has been torn down, destroyed, God will renew. It's a recreation. God will recreate the world. The world that is destroyed, that is getting from bad to worse, one day God will recreate everything. And so the book of Revelation talks about a new heaven and a new earth. to replace the old. So therefore, we are talking about not just an earthly, the Jews understand Messiah comes. When the Messiah comes, then the earth, the age will change. This is the present age where they believe they are now living. When the Messiah comes, then this is the messianic age, where Isaiah chapter 11 talks about the wolf will lie down with the lamb, and then a little child will lead them, and they believe that when the Messiah comes, the world will just change, but it's still on this earth. That is the Jewish understanding. The Jewish understanding is the world will be transformed. And for us, we believe that we are living now in this present age. When Christ comes again, a second coming, then the world will be destroyed and there will be no more there. And then we will have the Messianic age. The Messianic age, therefore, is a new age, a different world. Okay, the old world, as Peter says, will be rolled up like a scroll and burned up and destroyed. So there will be no more present age. So it will be a new Messianic age. So a new earth, a new Jerusalem. And so John sees the new Jerusalem descend down, come down from heaven and comes, and then this new age takes place. Okay, so these are the promises that the book holds. And therefore, if you are under siege, you turn to these promises and you find therefore very useful. They remind you that there are still these promises coming. So let me just end with this. Is it still relevant to us in our time? I think yes, because you can see we are also living in difficult times. We are also people living under trials, and we also have troubles. If we are having this thing, then the book is relevant. But if you are a church which is upper middle class, you don't feel the threat and all this, or perhaps you are the church in the West, far away from ISIS, far away from all this, then this book may not be relevant. You see, it all depends whether the book is relevant to you or not relevant to you. If you are very comfortable, you're living with no difficulty, you're not living in difficult times, you're so comfortable, or you're far away from all the threats of ISIS or whatever, then life is so sweet, no problem. Then the book doesn't make sense to you. But we are people in Malaysia, we are living in what we call the 1040 window, and we are living in places where we have all these trials. Think of all these things that are happening to our nation. And that's why we can read Revelation with a lot of relevance. We have local problems. Don't you find sometimes harassment from the local authorities? You apply for something, the governments cannot this, cannot that. You can have delays in your approval to build your building. You can get denial for permits. You want to go for caroling, they say no, cannot this year. And we find a lot of problems, local problems. National problems, the 3A issues: Allah, Alkitab, apostasy, and whether there will be a fourth A to come in the years to come. And then now we have enforced disappearance of Pastor Raymond and that Malay couple, Pastor Hilmi and his wife Ruth. First time we have this, and I think they cannot produce them because I think they're already martyrs. These are our first Christian martyrs in Malaysia. And we are really seeing this happening. So don't be like a tortoise, still inside your shell, or like an ostrich with your head in the sand. Already we are having this enforced disappearance. It's already, we know there's already a cover up. Nobody wants to admit something has happened to these two birds. And then we look at it in the global, we have all these religious wars that are taking place. Climate change is forcing the world to, melting the ice caps and all these natural catastrophes. Things are happening, typhoons, earthquakes. Well, these are all what Jesus says are birth pains. But this is still not the end. All these things might happen first, and then the end will come. So if we are living in a time where all these birth pains, Revelation makes a lot of sense. Because we are people under stress, under siege. We read it, the book gives us a lot of hope, gives us promises that will come, and we know ultimately good triumphs over evil. The book of Revelation doesn't tell us that evil will triumph in the end, but good will triumph in the end. Okay, so time for Q&A. No questions?
Reverend Anthony.
Yep,
Uh,
Edwin.
yes. Uh, just now you're talking about the millennium rule, where new heaven and new earth. So, in your opinion, that would be actually a new heaven and new earth created in the present earth that will be renewed as a new heaven and new earth. And that's the first question. Then the other question is, how long will be the millennium rule? Is it 1,000 years? Or, in your opinion, how long would that be?
Okay, you see, if you hold the view that millennium is symbolic, then it answers the second question. When we go to heaven and you're living in the millennial age, there's no more end. There's no end to it because in heaven there's no time. There's no time frame in heaven. So how do you measure time in heaven? So in heaven, when we are lifted out, just like what John says in chapter 4, he was taken up to heaven, and in heaven, he saw a huge crowd there. People of every tribe, tongue, and nation. I think what John saw is at the end time when everything is over and everybody's getting to heaven, he was taken there, and in heaven, everything is already over because there's no time frame. Time is only applicable on earth, not in heaven. So therefore, when we talk about millennium as the period where God will create after the second coming, then there is no time frame to that. The millennial age is a new age, the messianic age. There's no time frame. It only has a time frame in the dispensationalist view because that millennium is only temporal. For them, they believe that the church is raptured, tribulation takes place, and then the devil is let loose for 1,000 years. That millennium, 1,000 years has a time frame, and then Christ comes again, and then this time the devil will be thrown in the lake of fire, and then they will end. So if you take that view, then your millennium has a time frame of so-called 1,000 years. So as I say, I don't believe in the dispensationalist view. So my view is something like symbolic, and yet it's something that is also historical. But I will not try to interpret the events in Revelation and try to pinpoint them exactly to a human event. Because in the past, everybody has done that and everybody has failed. Martin Luther thought he was living in the end times. Well, it didn't happen in his time. People in the First World War, when the war was breaking, they thought it was end times. Well, we have already lived since then. People in the Second World War thought there was the end of time. We have passed from there. So in every age, people have been proven wrong. So therefore, I think the futurist view is a reminder that you can hold things in the future, but the moment you start identifying them, you become the historist view. And that's where you have problem. What if you are proven wrong? Then you revise your view. Then how long you keep on revising? It's like the Jehovah's Witness. They predicted that Christ comes in 1910. 1910. Well, Christ didn't come. Then, we got it the date wrong. They change it 1917. Second time, Christ didn't come. Then they say, we actually make a wrong calculation. It's 1919. They actually predicted Christ coming 3 times 100 years ago. Now, seriously, if you are a Christian, you will say, hey, how can you get it wrong? You simply tembak one, tembak two kali, and then if you keep on tembak like that means it shows that you guys don't understand, don't know how to interpret. And in the Old Testament, if you are proven wrong as a prophet, you'll be stoned to death. So the futurist view, the moment you start pinpointing events and you're proven wrong, you become like a historist view. So there's a danger. So I don't try to read the Antichrist. People say Antichrist, Adolf Hitler. Where are all these people who say Antichrist was Adolf Hitler? Then people at that time were saying Joseph Stalin was Antichrist. Well, all these are not true. In every age, as John says, there will be Antichrist. In his letters of 2nd John, 3rd John, he talks about there are many Antichrists. But in the final part, there will be one capital A Antichrist, the supreme one. But in every age, there will be leaders and people who act as an Antichrist. Antichrist simply means someone who goes against God. So Emperor Nero was an Antichrist. Emperor Domitian was an Antichrist. And I think in a way, Hitler, Stalin, Mao Zedong, everybody has been an Antichrist, maybe small a now. And we just have to wait, maybe one day there may be a big A in a sense. So the symbolic pattern tells us that these are timeless truths. This whole idea of struggle, challenge, all these are happening in every age. Paul thought it would be happening in his time. So when he wrote Thessalonians, he talked about the second coming of Christ, but it didn't happen in his time. Martin Luther thought it would happen in his time in the 15th century. It didn't happen in his time. So I think in every age, it's just a reminder to us, in every age, there will be the same pattern. There will be people who will rise up against God, and there will be people who will challenge you. Remember what Jesus says? Many will come in my name, and then will lead many people astray. And then someone will come and say, I am he, no, I am Christ. Don't go, Jesus. Don't go and follow this guy. Already Jesus warned us there will be many deceivers. Sai Baba came one time and claimed to be Jesus. He himself made a claim to be Jesus. Okay, but today Sai Baba is already long dead. Then you have the founder of the Munis, the Unification Church. He claimed he was the Lord of the second advent. He claimed to be the Christ of the second coming. He's already dead now. His wife has now taken over the leadership together with the children. See, everybody has come and claimed. And so to me, it's a pattern that is repeated in history. So I will not be tempted to try to prophesy and predict an event. I'll be just saying these are lessons for me to learn, to be aware that Christ is coming soon, and at every age, perhaps the cycle gets shorter. Like birth pangs, the birth pangs comes increasingly shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter, and then comes the birth. So maybe we are seeing more and more these things happening. That's because a shorter cycle is coming as well. So I take it more as a symbolic thing in a sense, rather than to read it as something that is literal and chronological. That's where the danger is in some of these AG people. You know, they literally claim they're living in end times and they're seeing all this unfolding. One pastor just contacted me today. He says, in my church, the people are reading all the fighting between Hamas and Israel as end times. And I say, well, people have done that before. In every age, all these people have been interpreting such things as well. Okay. And yet Jesus says, no, this is not the end. These are just the birth pangs. So we're going to read Revelation also together with Matthew 26, the Olivet Discourse about Jesus talking about what's going to happen soon, and read it and see that, no, they're just pointing towards the future. So the temptation is trying to pinpoint. Now, if Jesus says, even the Son of Man doesn't know when exactly the day he will come, and if Jesus confessed that he doesn't even know when he's coming, who are we to go and try to pinpoint exactly when is the second coming? Remember, in the 70s, it was very popular. If you hold a dispensationalist position, you say the rapture will happen 7 years before the tribulation. This is the pre-tribulation view. And so everybody is claiming that 1988 was the second coming. Now, why 1988? Very simple. 1948, Israel was founded back as a nation. One generation after that, plus 40 years, 1988. 7 years before that, Christ will come, rapture. So 1981, what's the rapture? Have you ever heard this view before? And I remember when 1981 came, everybody was all waiting for rapture to happen. Why? 7 years before 1988. And why 1988? Second coming. Because 4 years after the founding of the nation of Israel. They take that story of Jesus about the fig tree, bearing fruit and all this, and they say there is a indication of the nation of Israel becoming back a nation 1948. So one generation plus 40 years 1988 minus the 7 years backward, rapture takes place in 1981. So everybody was waiting in 1981 for rapture. Well, you and me are still around, so obviously rapture did not take place in 1981. Then some people said maybe then rapture is not 7 years, but 3.5 years before. That is the mid-tribulation position. Then we waited. 3.5 years later was 1984. Also nothing happened. Then came 1988. Also nothing happened. In fact, I got married in 1988. So nothing happened. So today that view has been thrown and discarded. Now, what happened to those people who propose a view like this? They just continue on. But to me, I would say you should shoot them. You make a prediction and you're proven wrong, then you better leave it out. You should deny and say, look, sorry, I got it all wrong. But that's why you have all these books that are in the market. Tim LaHaye, the Left Behind series, they're so popular and all this because they're playing on these type of things. They're playing on all these conspiracy theories, and the Americans are suckers for conspiracy theories, I tell you. Seriously, I have so much problem with American friends, those who are lay people, and they're just so in their mind, all this conspiracy, QAnon and all these things, and they're thinking, yeah, all this is happening, and so they just believe in all this. And they've been proven wrong umpteen times. I think I mentioned to you, go and Google this guy, Harold Camp, HAROLD CAMP. He was the one that made prediction the world was coming to an end 2 years ago. It didn't happen. He revised the dates. I would say you are a false prophet. Be gone. So if you want to take Revelation and try to prophesy, I would say fine. Put a time frame and then we wait and see. If nothing happens, then you're proven to be wrong. And many people have been proven to be wrong.
Dr. Anthony, can I interrupt?
Sure.
So concerning this fourth view that you told us about, idealist, everything is symbolic. Would you say that a person who holds this view holds heaven and hell and Satan as symbolic? That means they don't literally believe in heaven and hell and Satan. So heaven is symbolic, hell is symbolic.
No, they're saying the images in the book of Revelation are symbolic. That means John is trying to convey lessons, truths with all these symbols. The truths are there, but to explain the truth using all these symbols. So therefore, he's not saying that heaven is symbolic and there's no heaven. No, he's not saying that. He's saying that when you have all these 7 bowls of wrath, that means they're not literal 7 bowls. They're just a cyclic pattern of 7. 7 trumpets, a cyclic pattern of 7. So the idealist view is just saying that, when you take the 1,000, it's not exactly 1,000 times 365 days. It's just a long period of time. 1,000. So when you talk about the number in heaven, the 144,000 witnesses, you take that as a literal, the heaven is a very small place, smaller than even Seremban. Come on, how can heaven be so small? 144,000 only. And you and me and all of us in the GGBP are not in heaven because our names are not there. Because heaven already filled up. 144,000 is a very small number. No, I think it's a symbolic number. It's 12 times 12 times 1,000. The 12 tribes of Israel plus the 12 apostles, the new and the old Israel times 1,000 is a symbolic number of all God's people. See, you have to apply some sense of symbolism to some of those images and numbers. They are not literal. No, 144,000 is not a literal number in that sense. They represent the 12 sons of Israel, the old Israel, the 12 apostles, the new Israel, the new church, times 1,000, all God's people. They're just a symbol of all God's people from Old Testament time to New Testament time. That's all.
So I'm going to ask you a very personal question.
The danger is you hold it literal. Like I think Mormons and JW hold it. Yeah. The Mormons and JW hold it as a literal number, and therefore they say it's already full. Heaven is already full. Therefore, the rest of them have to work their way to salvation. That's why the Mormons live 2 years of life as a missionary to work, to earn their way to heaven. It's built into their beliefs. Because they believe that the 144,000 already filled up already long before then. Well, I would say no, you don't treat that number as a literal number.
Somebody asked me, Reverend Doctor, somebody asked me, does Dr. Anthony Loke believe in a real heaven and the real earth and the real Satan?
Why not? Why not?
That's the personal question I asked.
Yeah.
You believe
No,
in
all I'm saying is these things are true.
Gold and
how does John convey this whole eternal struggle between good and evil? He talks about that cycle 7 on 7 and 7. To me, it's not 21 things. It's not 7 plus 7 plus 7, 21 events. To me, it is 7 things, perfect number, repeated 3 times perfect number. It's an ongoing cycle of events that are happening. Okay. Things will go from bad to worse and all this. So, and I think in a way, you look at it, you realize in every age, things are happening again and again. I think it's cyclical. Deja vu many times. Okay. I believe in heaven and new age. You're not. What's the point then being a Christian? You're not. You are not going to go to heaven when you die.
Now I'm asking whether you believe in the literal heaven, like with streets of gold and the river of life and all that.
See, how do you define heaven? Heaven is more than 3 dimensions. See, we are always trying to interpret heaven in our 3 dimension world, 3D. 3D is length, breadth, height. We can only understand things with length, breadth, height. What if God is 4D, 5D? Okay, beyond length, breadth, and height. Because God is spirit. And so God lives in heaven, which is spirit. You can't define it with human terms. To define God in human terms is what we call anthropomorphic language. So we say God has an arm, God has a feet, but God is beyond that. God is spirit. But for convenience, we describe God like his arm can bend a bowl of bronze, his feet, above a firmament of like sea of glass, and that's what the Moses and the 70 elders saw. We can only describe God using anthropomorphic terms because that's the only way to describe him. But God is spirit beyond that. You see? So when you look at the images of Jesus, that's why the images of Jesus are very interesting. The images of Jesus in Revelation do not conform to our usual idea of Jesus. We are so used to the human Jesus. When you read Revelation, hair burning gold and white and eyes shining like the sun, and out of his mouth come out a sword. Now, how do you see the physical Jesus like that? Sword coming out of the mouth all the time? Can't be, man. How do you want to talk with a sword coming out of your mouth? No, these are all images that John used to convey something more glorious, something that is more powerful. It is like asking Michelangelo, who lived in the 14th century, to try to describe a television set. How does a man like Michelangelo, who lived in the 14th century, describe a television set? He'll probably say it's a box with tiny people inside. See, he's using language of his time to describe something beyond his time. I think John, when he looks in the heaven and he's looking at heaven realities, is trying to describe with human words the heavenly realities in human form, in human words. And words sometimes are vehicles to convey, but they fail because there's no way. Like the army, he describes the army with like locals with long hair, make a lot of noise. He's trying to describe something, but he doesn't have the words, the vocab. And so he's trying to use vocab to describe. That's why we have difficulty also trying to read. What is that dragon with the 7 heads? And if you are a Jew or Jewish Christian, you are aware of the numbers, the symbolism of numbers. 7, 3 are all numbers which has certain significance behind. 3 and 7 are numbers of perfection used for God. So short of 7 is 6, and 6 is often a human number. So when you look at the mark of the beast, 666, just telling you is a human number. One short of 777. 777 will be perfection. God, 7, 3, perfect, also 7. So it's 3 times 7, but it's 666, one short. I don't think it's a number for us to calculate and try to get a human name. Because if you calculate that, what do you use? You use English alphabets to calculate the number, you're going to get it wrong. Are you going to use Hebrew numbers to calculate the name to total up to 66? Or are you going to use Greek to calculate to 66? Never easy to read. Yeah, never easy. It's, as I say, it's a struggle because many of it, I think, is not just one view. I think some of us, we use a few views together. That's where sometimes the confusion comes in. On one hand, you want to interpret it according to history. On the other hand, we also want to interpret it as symbolically. And then we're also tempted to try to identify events. We find ourselves actually holding 3 views. But the 3 views will have problems. They will have a tension between. How do you hold 3 views together? I think that is a difficult part. Okay.
Reverend Anthony, I want to ask something.
Yes, Eileen.
I would like to ask regarding the 42 months and times 30 days to be 1260 days. And then about the first 3 years and half to be peace. That means is God will protect Israel.
Well, you hold a dispensationalist view. That's why you interpret all this. I don't hold a dispensation view. So I don't see
the
the
Chinese
numbers as exactly 1260. They are just symbolic numbers.
Oh, I see. Then what
Yeah.
about the 后3年半? Oh, you are not yourself.
It's
You
going back to
agree
Daniel.
on all these views or what? You don't agree with what those
No, I don't hold a dispensationalist view of trying to read scripture.
Oh, okay. Then what are the
Because I just
purposes
said
of this?
dispensationalism is not found in the Bible. It was taught by another man just about 100 over years ago. It's like, to me, dispensation is not the way to read scripture.
Oh, I see.
It's an external thing pushed into the framework. I have shared this as a seminar with some people before on this whole idea of dispensationalism. Who was Jan Darby? How they come up with this view, and what does this view do as we read scripture? And I explained to you how it got into the Scofield Bible, from there went into US and planted itself into Dallas. And today, Dallas is a hotbed for dispensationalist teaching. And then the Southern Belt, all the Baptist people, most of them are dispensationalists. And then it came into the East to China through Watchman Nee, and you find today a lot of Chinese people hold this view of dispensationalism. Unfortunately, okay. So I don't hold this view. I don't read Tim LaHaye or this. Sorry, I don't believe in that view.
Now the first the 7 years talking about the time of revelation, I mean tribulation. What the purpose is that? Is it for the Israel, the chosen nation, the people of Israel, then for the sin of the people in the world, and then for punish Satan? That's all the purpose.
When you read Revelation, I don't think the nation of Israel is that important. To me, it's all God's people who are the ones who are suffering in the book of Revelation, not the nation of Israel. Where do you have to read the nation of Israel in the chapters 4 to 22? Seriously. I mean, you look at all those like the seven seal, these are all happening to things in the world. It's not the nation of Israel. And then if you hold a dispensationalist view, and then the rapture comes, and then all the Christians are raptured to heaven, then who is left to do the work of evangelism and witnessing? And then this view says, oh, then God will turn the Jews, and then they become. But why would the Jews become God's witnesses then? Makes no sense. See, you are forcing a lot of reading into a text like Revelation, which to me doesn't make sense. Be true to the text. What I'm teaching you all is very simple. Read the text. Don't import a foreign viewpoint into it. Read the text. Does it actually mention Israel? So to me, the modern day nation of Israel, to me, is just any other nation. It will be subject to God's judgment. They are not a special people in that sense. They are special people by race, being born, but they're not. God is not going to use the nation of Israel. So I don't look to the nation of Israel today as a fulfillment of prophecies before Christ comes. I look to the church as the fulfillment of all the prophecies. The church is the new Israel, not the nation of Israel. I don't hold that view. To me, Netanyahu, Benjamin, all these will have to face punishment. God will just judge them as any other nation. Yeah. In fact, some Jews don't even hold the view that the nation of Israel in 1948 is that messianic kingdom that God wanted to rebuild. Some of these Orthodox Jews reject the nation of Israel as a secular construct, a secular concept. It started off as a product of Zionism, nothing to do with God. Yeah, there are many many Orthodox Jews who don't accept the nation of Israel as God's plan. See, dispensationalism holds a very strong view and love for the nation of Israel. That's why look at the Baptists. You know, the Baptists, Southern Baptists are all for Israel. Why? Because of the dispensationalist teaching.
Oh, okay, I see.
Whereas in England, many of the Christians in England don't support Israel. So I was talking with a professor, and my professor says, you know, our poor American cousins are still so hung up with this idea of the nation of Israel. And they have already moved. Remember, J.N. Darby was an English fellow. Dispensationalism started in UK. It went across the seas into US, planted itself in Dallas. That's why the Southern Bible Belt is the hotbed of dispensational teaching. But UK people already rejected dispensationalism. Today, you find dispensation is rejected across the board in UK. It's not popular in UK. But yes, it's surviving in America, in the South, especially Southern Baptists.
Mm-hmm.
You understand the roots of how it traveled. And then he went to Asia, and that's why it has also a hotbed here. And today, you go sometimes to Salvation bookstore, you buy all these useless books you read, you end up reading all this trash. Seriously, you end up reading all this teaching about dispensationalism. I grew up on that diet. Those days I read Tim LaHaye, Salem Kirban, and all this. I was so into all this until when I began to read scripture, I said, no, that's not what scripture says.
Mm.
I read Thessalonians, Paul never talks about a rapture. Christ coming in the clouds is the second coming. J.N. Darby interpret that as rapture. That's why you talk about the thief in the night and all this. The thief in the night is just Christ coming at a different time which we don't know. That is the second coming. J.N. Darby takes the Thessalonians text and reinterpret that as rapture, which I think is wrong. Seriously wrong. You go back and read 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. You read that text about Jesus coming and the trumpet will blast, and then Christ comes like a thief in the night. That is not rapture. That is second coming, the parousia. He split the second coming into two events: a rapture, meet us halfway, take us back to heaven, and then come again a second time 1,000 years later. He split the second coming into two events, which I say, well, the Bible doesn't say that. It took me a long time to get out of all this dispensationalist teaching because, as I said, I grew up reading Reverend Ronnie Cohn, AVL's newsletters. I read all these books. I watched the movie Left Behind. Those days, A Thief in the Night, all this, our staple diet. Yeah, we watched all this. It was shown by Campbell's Crusade, who go around the churches showing the movie. I remember Thief in the Night was so fascinating. People were just driving a car, suddenly a driver disappears, left behind his clothes. I was so enraptured with all this. In the end, I go back to scripture and read it again and say, no, that's not what scripture is saying.
Mm-hmm.
You have to decide. I said you're going to read and decide for yourself. Read Revelation without importing in a external framework into it. Just read scripture and say, does it actually say that? I don't know. You'll be surprised to find that it doesn't really say that. That's what they try to make it up.
In reading of the Revelation, then shall we also read together the book of Daniel?
Yeah, the Revelation depends a lot on Daniel for the imageries.
Oh.
There's a lot of connection. That means Daniel was like the first of the type of apocalyptic using all this symbolism, numbers, imagery. John coming much later, century later, using the same type of imagery that's from there. So one can only understand Revelation when you also read a bit of Daniel.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Let me show you a bibliography at the end of my talk of material that I use, and I will show you some of the good books that you should perhaps keep an eye on. Okay, so I hope you can see there are 4 books which I refer to. One is by Michael J. Gorman, Reading Revelation Responsibly, Uncivil Worship and Weakness, Following the Lamb into the New Creation. Just came out about 11 years ago. It's an excellent book. I got an e-copy from the publisher to review, and I read it. I wrote a review of it. I sent that link to BD 2 weeks ago. And I think it's a really good book. It's like responsibly is a very important word. I don't think many of these AG people read Revelation responsibly. They're just importing a framework and forcing the text to fit the framework. And then when things don't work, reinterpret again. And so you find that constant, keep on constant revision. This one failed, target another guy as an antichrist. Keep on. You cannot be doing that. That's not a responsible way to read scripture. Then the other one is by Richard Bauckham, Theology of the Book of Revelation. It's a short book, written quite some time back, 1993. So if you want to again understand what is the Book of Revelation all about, what is the whole focus, that will be a good book to get. For commentary, I use G.K. Bill's commentary. He wrote a huge one that was almost 800 pages using a lot of Greek. This one, he came out with a shorter commentary, distilling many of the things from that huge commentary into a shorter one, published in 2015. I find it really very good. He's a British guy, very solid, faithful to the text, faithful to the interpretation. He doesn't import something there and try to read the text into it, but let the text say what it has to say. Then the final book is a book which I use to prepare the lecture for the 4 views. They get 4 different people who believe in these 4 different views: the preterists, the futurists, the idealists, and the historists. Each one of them representing one view, write on it to explain why they think and hold this view and how they will read the book that view. So it's actually a very thin book. I think maybe 120 pages. So that would be a good book to read out further on the 4 different views: preterists, historists, futurists, and idealists. So each one is each of the author is someone who holds that type of view. So we can see how using a view like that, that's how they read the book of Revelation. Okay, so these are good books to read. So I spent some time reading these 4 books just to prepare the 2 lectures. So if you're interested, you should maybe invest in some money. Get the short one, the 4 views on the book of Revelation. That will give you a thing. Or if you're interested in Gorman, Gorman has a very good view. He has written another book called Reading Paul. Very interesting. And then now he's writing some more books on that. So he is a great NT scholar. So I enjoy. If you are really serious and you really want to study Revelation in depth, then maybe consider G.K. Bill. I bought mine from SU Bookshop in PJ. So paperback. So it's not so costly, but worth really reading through and working through if you really want to get a grasp of the whole book. Okay, so that will be my recommendation. So if you want the 4 views, then get the 4 views on the book. If you want to find out what is that whole purpose of the book of Revelation, which is my tomorrow's sermon, then read Gorman. If you really wanted to have a good commentary on Revelation, this commentary is written 6 years ago, so it should be quite up to date, very relevant, and very useful. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So
any other questions?
So tomorrow's sermon will continue on that whole idea of the focus. What is the focus of the book?
Anybody else has a question? If not, we would just like to thank Dr. Anthony Loke very much for tonight's session and look forward to tomorrow's sermon. Thank you very much and good night, everyone.